So it's 2021 now, and this is the first podcast of the new year from me, John. I'm the host of uh, the um, the Made in Turkey podcast. I've almost forgot the name of my own podcast for a second there because I've been very busy. But anyway, it's 2021, and welcome to Axel Çorlu. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself and tell the listeners what your current position is.
Sure. I've been in academia for more than 20 years now. I have a lot of different fields, mainly history, but several others as well: political science, intelligence studies, and so on. And within history, I've been working on a huge variety of subjects, as you probably know. But one of them has been military history, and more specifically, the military-industrial complex in modern times. So that's one of the things that I've been working on, and. Um, in terms of my research or teaching activities, I've taught courses on this subject for the last 7, 8 years now. And I'm working on a couple of articles right now, in fact, about the state of the military industrial complex, not just in Turkey, which is, a sort of significant element now that we're talking about it, of course, but also worldwide and in the US, of course.
Yeah, so as you said, we're talking about Turkey's military-industrial complex at the moment. I guess we can call it Turkey's military-industrial complex, although that's a phrase that you usually associate with the United States. But perhaps the Americanization of Turkey's military, perhaps to some extent. Although we're not going to talk about necessarily the kind of the history of the formation of Turkey's military industrial complex as it was during the 20th century. Certainly, as a member of NATO, there was a kind of tutelary period of US kind of advice giving, which helped to kind of set up Turkey's military in the form that it is now. So I'm just going to give a short introduction that's based on a recent Carnegie Endowment report, which had a look at the current state of Turkey's military industry. Because I think it's a good place to start in terms of understanding what the current state of play is. So obviously Turkey has the second largest army in NATO, behind the US, and it currently has around 355,000 troops. And there's been a lot of discussion in the media about the kind of recent progress that Turkey has made, especially in terms of unmanned aerial vehicles and drone warfare, which we saw recently with the use of Turkish drones by Azerbaijan in their conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. The Carnegie Endowment report says that Turkey's growing defense industry is a cornerstone of Erdogan's independent and assertive foreign policy for two core reasons. The industry steers attention away from Turkey's currency crisis and troubled foreign policy. I think, although that's part of the way to see the promotion of Turkey's military successes, there is also, there has been real progress in some areas as well. Turkey now has 7 companies in the list of the top 100 world defense companies, including Aselsan, Turkish Aerospace Industries, BMC Automotive, Roketsan, STM Savunma, Teknolojileri Mühendislik ve Ticaret, FNSS Savunma Sistemleri, and Havelsan. But having said that, the bottom 5 of these are placed at number 89 and higher. So there's only really a couple of really big ones, the top 2 in that list. The growth of these companies means Turkey now imports far less military hardware, down from 70% of its total to 30% in the past 5 years. And according to Carnegie, the Turkish arms industry grew from 1 billion in 2002 to 11 billion in 2020, more than 3 billion of which were exports, making Turkey the 14th largest global defense exporter. Following the constitutional referendum in 2017, Erdogan brought the Undersecretariat for Defense Industries, which we'll be talking about, the SSB, under the presidency's direct control and renamed it the Presidency of Defense Industries. This underscores how the growth of Turkey's defense sector has become a personal project of the president. But is the growth of Turkey's defense industry as big a success as it seems, or is its importance inflated? So Carnegie's report notes that much like Turkey's other mega projects, the Istanbul Canal, Selim Sultan Bridge, the new Istanbul Airport, and the Jamlika Mosque, the Turkey's defense industry is as much about projecting an image of power as to the domestic population as it is for external consumption. Turkey is still dependent on imports for some key components, such as engines to power its domestic military equipment. The US embargo on some types of engine mean Turkey could lose $1 billion in revenue on military exports. And this lack of engines is also causing delays in completion of Turkey's first domestically produced battle tank, the Altay, which is produced by Otokar, I think, which we'll also be talking about. According to Carnegie, Turkey relies on German engine expertise to produce these tanks, and Germany is withholding technology from Turkey due to political concerns. Turkey's Akinci drone is also dependent on Ukrainian engines. Many of Turkey's Navy ships were designed in Germany, and its efforts to produce a domestic fighter jet rely on a partnership with an increasingly reluctant British company. The need for assistance from foreign companies is related to the importance of intellectual property and patents owned by companies for various parts. Carnegie also identified currency depreciation and the ongoing purge of public sector officials following the failed 2016 coup as problems affecting the Turkish defense sector. In 2018, 270 senior defense contractors were either headhunted or left Turkey in pursuit of better opportunities abroad. So is the Turkish defense industry about to run out of steam as these structural factors catch up with it? I think there's a bunch of ways that we can look at this, but I don't know if you perhaps want to start off by just we can talk about the Presidency of Defense Industries first, because it's been in the news since its head, Ismail Demir, who, if you look at his Atlantic Council speech that he gave in 2016, he comes across very much as a sort of a softly spoken kind of academic engineer. So it's kind of interesting that he's been targeted. I don't know if you want to start off talking about what the current role of the Presidency of Defense Industries is in Turkey's wider ambitions for its military-industrial complex, because it's obviously a key part and is one that is directly controlled by Erdogan himself.
Right, and the answer really is not that long. It's rather straightforward. It is an attempt by Erdogan. It's essentially created to be Erdogan's immediate sort of extension in controlling how the Turkish defense industry operates, how closely it's integrated, the state versus the private sector, how closely they're integrated. It really has a lot of ability to coordinate these things. It certainly runs very significant contracts and so on and so forth, which also brings with it a lot of responsibility, a lot of potential for corruption, and so on. We just, in fact, just before this, we were talking about this very new event where Turkish authorities actually placed under custody a number of very significant people involved with the Presidency of Defense Industries, including, let me see the title again, the project director of Unmanned and Intelligent Systems Department. I mean, this is very significant. And of course, we only know what the news reports are telling us, but from that, what we can understand from that, there are claims about, or allegations about corruption involving contracts, about leaking information to probably suitors or companies that are going to be bidding. So there are significant issues that accompany, creating a central institution like this that's so close to Erdogan himself, and so on and so forth as well.
Am I right in saying that the SSB, its kind of role is as the kind of director of kind of investments in the broader industry? Like, if the government kind of says we're a bit weak in this area, we want to make some investments with these private companies in terms of homemade technology for a particular thing that we can't do at the moment.
Right, and it's basically the main tool of implementing the strategies and the priorities for the near and medium and long-term future of the Turkish military-industrial complex, the Turkish military investment, and the defense sector overall.
How does it relate to the kind of second most important institution within Turkey's military-industrial complex, which is the Turkish Armed Forces Foundation? The TAF website says that incorporating the building blocks of the national defense industries such as Aselsan, TAI, Roketsan, Havelsan, Ishbir, and Aspelsan, and so it has all those companies within it. It kind of owns those companies, and it continues to spend its income for the development of the defense industry. It says it's transferred a total of 32.8 million Turkish liras from its premiums collected from its associations to the Defense Industry Support Fund. So it collects money from this support fund and then distributes it to companies. So it's a bit like the Presidency of Defense Industries as well, but not controlled by the presidency.
Right, and it has a history that's much older than that, of course. That has been around for a long, long time, and has been involved in multiple defense industries for a very long time, unlike, the relatively new Presidency of Defense Industries. But I would say in terms of actually directing things, you have to look at the Presidency of Defense Industries, not the TAF. And even though it's still a significant presence, it's a significant component of all kinds of important companies like Roketsan and Havelsan and so on. It is not in a position of directing policy. It is not in a position of establishing priorities and making major decisions. It's more a component at this point than in a directive capacity.
So maybe we can kind of give a broader kind of look at what the current situation within within Turkey's military is in terms of how Turkey sees its role in its region and how it wants to use its military to achieve that. I mean, I think a lot of people since the kind of collapse of the Davutoglu era, zero problems foreign policy. Turkey has moved towards this kind of, certainly what a lot of Western people would see as a kind of irredentist position. Obviously, Turkey sees its role in its region differently to how previous Turkish governments in the 90s and before saw its role, and the state is, it's kind of. It's kind of bounced back almost from its post Ottoman hangover, Kemalist kind of isolationism, to being a significant player in its region, and with that comes the temptation to want to question some of the borders of maritime borders, which were never really set that sharply in the first place to some extent. But also, there's one of the things that interests me is this kind of almost conspiratorial belief that some Turkish nationalists have that the 100th anniversary of the Lausanne Treaty in 2023 means that it expires or something, and that means that Turkey can therefore renegotiate its boundaries. I mean, do you think that Erdogan really, does he think that way, or is this kind of just like a fun subplot that a lot of nationalists are into? But I mean, there is a real kind of wanting to expand Turkish influence.
Well, to begin with, it's difficult to really know what Erdogan thinks. And there's a difference between what he as a person might be thinking and what Turkey does in its foreign policy. It's not the same thing. But as far as the whole nationalist vision of these things, let's briefly talk about that for a moment. I mean, all nationalisms up to a point require a degree of definition of some kind of external enemy. Vis-a-vis you sort of position yourself. There's always some kind of force outside that's trying to do something to you. In Turkish nationalism, this has been a very prominent feature for a long time, long before the rise of Erdogan and everything. It has been there for a long time. But the way that Turkey reacted in terms of its foreign policy and how that nationalism informed its foreign policy, there's a difference. There's a very clear difference. And even when we look at the first part of the Erdogan era, with Davutoglu and the so-called zero problems with neighbors policy, what's informing it, when you look at it behind it, is what's perhaps, I'm not sure I agree with the term, but neo-Ottomanism comes to mind. That's the term that a lot of people use. Let's use that as a shortcut now, even though there are serious problems with associating Ottomans with this new thing. And a lot of historians have pointed it out correctly, but let's just use it as a shortcut. This neo-Ottomanist vision is, what is it? Well, it means that Turkey wants to see itself as a significant player in its region. It wants to sort of remind the different countries and peoples around it of, what used to be and how grand that vision was and so on. As is typical of these kinds of visions, there's nothing negative, in history about all this. It's always positive. It was great before the fall of the Ottoman Empire and so on. And it feeds off that sort of nostalgia on one part, and then channels it into a foreign policy that was supposed to benefit Turkey in the real world. And even with Davutoğlu's policy, we were looking at something that was different compared to the period before that. I mean, Davutoğlu was still engaging with the neighbors, and his policy, his ideas, and so on was still about engagement, and there was still an element of expansionism there, but not the military, the hard power element. There was more of a soft power sort of emphasis to that. Regardless of that, it is also neo-Ottomanist. It was not, something that was isolationist and let's just, keep to our borders and keep to ourselves and so on. It sought to leverage Turkey's increasing cultural influence, for example, through things like, media. There are all these Turkish series that are, very popular across the Middle East and even beyond. So these were the kinds of things that perhaps it sought to leverage. But there has been, of course, a significant shift since then. And the hard power element has come, forward much more clearly. In that sense, if we're looking at its capability and what it wants to do with it, let's not forget that until very recently, the Turkish defense industry was nothing to really speak of. It was not, at the moment, we can talk about different sort of levels where it stands vis-a-vis other significant defense industries and so on. We can do that in a few minutes. But it was nowhere near what it is now. As recently as 2004, its defense exports were about 100 million, 100 something, maybe just under 200 million. Look at the exponential growth in that. That's a huge growth from that to 3 billion in 15 years. That's a massive growth that you won't see in a lot of sectors in a lot of countries. And that also, of course, shadows Turkey's increasingly aggressive, increasingly hard power-oriented moves in places like Syria, Libya, and so on and so forth.
Would you say that one potential ambition of Turkey's foreign policy and of its military-industrial complex is the possibility of it becoming essentially a non-aligned country? When I was looking at the Atlantic Council video that Ismail Demir, the head of the Presidency of Defense Industries, had given in 2016, I think, he said at that time that whatever is going on in terms of internal politics in Turkey, there's one basic policy that will not change. That policy is that Turkey is a strong ally of the West. This is the one determined policy. We know that there are ups and downs and differences of opinion, but Turkey does not have any other direction to go. Of course, we will try to settle our differences, and there will be some differences, but that main policy will not change and will be based on rule of law, democracy, human rights, and those kind of values that all humanity commonly hold. Gesture vaguely to human rights and democracy there. So, notwithstanding that, and obviously Erdogan has recently also come out and said we see our future in Europe. So, obviously, I think Erdogan would like the option of being of not having to deal with NATO, maybe, but obviously he still does to a large extent. So there's a kind of conflictual thing there of like, yeah, we kind of are facing in two directions here. Like we're saying to our old allies, we're still part of your security, collective, but at the same time, we're kind of doing our best to make it so that we don't have to be part of that.
Right. I think there are two levels here. So one level is the sort of self-sufficiency argument, the independence argument, the non-alignment argument. That's an extension of these arguments, in fact, to some extent, on a military level, both from a military industry, defense industry level, and just pure military level. And that actually goes beyond the Erdogan regime. You can go all the way back for the discussions about that to the 1974 Cyprus, war that, where, Turkey sort of went into Cyprus and so on and so forth. And there was an American embargo there that, made a lot of Turkish authorities and part of the public realize that, with an embargo like that, everything suddenly comes to a halt. We can't do anything. We have to be more independent. We have to be more self-sufficient and so on and so forth. That aligned very nicely with the so-called anti-imperialist rhetoric at the time, of the 70s and so on. And interestingly, it also aligned very nicely with what Erdogan has been saying, throughout his regime of creating a non-aligned Turkey and so on and so forth. That's the more military aspect. But there's also a larger element here, and the larger element is that the Turkish public has been fed and a sophisticated, comprehensive information campaign, starting from very early age, education throughout the education system, throughout the, the life of a person, average Turkish person, through the media, through a whole bunch of other outlets. And politicians of all sorts, not just on the right or the left, but all sorts of politicians have been repeating this refrain, and that is, Turkey needs to be independent. As long as we're associated with these kinds of structures like NATO and so on, they are nice and so on and so forth. But at its core, we have to be able to do whatever we want for our own interests. And when our interests don't align, we have to have the option of doing what we need to do. And that has become stronger. That sort of idea has become stronger and stronger. So it is supported by a significant chunk of the Turkish public. It's not something that the Erdogan regime by itself is inventing or just sort of foisting upon the public. It's feeding off it and in turn feeds it. Now, as far as what they're doing, I very much agree with what you're saying. On the one hand, they're giving these very sort of nicely worded messages about human rights and democracy, and whether there's a hypocrisy there, you can, that's a different subject. But that Turkey is still aligned with the West, it's going to be part of NATO, blah, blah, blah. And at the same time, you look at the actions of the regime, and they are not in alignment with that at all. And that's on multiple levels. We're not just talking about the S-400 crisis that, it is really the catalyst. It's not just one thing. It's the catalyst that brought everything to this point. But also think about Libya. When Turkey got involved in Libya, and you look at the timeline of events in Libya, you're looking at a situation where it could have dragged NATO itself into a war. This wasn't, an impossibility. There was a possibility of that. So how does NATO, for example, respond to something like that? If one of its members is doing things that are not aligned with its established priorities, with its established positions and so on, it's doing things on its own that might drag you into something that you don't want to be involved in.
We've seen that the answer is sanctions, apparently. I mean, from both the European Union and from the United States. They seem to believe that that's maybe their only option, in terms of, and I think, it's worth saying maybe that, what the Carnegie Endowment analysis kind of does show is that there are, as much as the Turkish military industry has progressed a lot, there's still weaknesses in terms of the supply chain and getting particular components from allies that does, it does risk meaning that they can't export as much military equipment to other people as they would like to. And just the other day, I saw that a campaign by Armenians in the UK and I think diaspora Armenians in general convinced a British company to stop Ander to stop exporting fuel pumps that Baykar was using for its UAVs, having been shown evidence that they were used by Azerbaijan in its Nagorno-Karabakh war, which apparently they didn't realize. It's I read the statement that the company said, and they said after an investigation we have realized that our fuel pumps were being used in military drones, and it's like, did you not know that your fuel pumps were being bought by a military drone company to make military drones? I mean, it seems a bit strange to me that they were not aware of the fact that they were selling military equipment. I mean, maybe it was classed as dual use by the British government, and then there's the other question of like, I know that not getting into Britain's huge military industry and the way that Britain supports its foreign policy by exporting military hardware as well, but that the fact that the export credit guarantee department, which gives licenses to export military equipment, licensed this stuff in the first place is interesting. But lots of other Western countries, Canada had a similar experience, I think, as well, with one of its companies, where they even made an exception. I think they had an arms embargo following the military operation into northeastern Syria that Turkey did in 2019, but then they created an exception for certain parts. So I think it's worth saying that Turkey still has this vulnerability in its supply chains for a lot of its major things that it is producing, and that goes for the domestically produced car as well. I mean, Turkey has I think it's worth saying maybe that, as well as the prestige of the military industry, which like you were saying, Turkey is quite a militarized society in terms of all men have to do military service. Everybody knows people who whose families are military connected. So I think it's quite different from a lot of Western societies in that respect, that you can use the prestige of the military to for kind of political purposes in a way you can't really in a lot of other countries. But yeah, so I don't know to what extent is is a lot of this kind of promotional bluster for domestic military consumption in that respect, it certainly seems like its ability to be self-sufficient is not as great as it would like its public to believe it is.
Well, I think that's a great question, and has a long answer, really. But to begin with, what you were mentioning just before that about these companies somehow discovering that they were selling parts that were used in military hardware and so on, that they didn't know that this was going on. There was also an Austrian example when you were talking. I was thinking about several examples along those lines. And it boils down to, the concept of plausible deniability. There's no way that a company, at least some people in that company, do not realize that what they're selling, the components they're selling, are being used for, military hardware in the end. There's just no way that they wouldn't be aware of that. But there's plausible deniability. It's a concept that politicians and, businessmen have used for a long time. So they can always probably make an argument like that and get away with that. But it also shows us another sort of pressure point on Turkey's military industry, its defense industry, and that is it's trying to find loopholes. It's trying to find ways around existing things, even before the CATSA stuff, to acquire components that it can then use in its military industry. That pressure was already there. It wasn't just a new thing that came up with CATSA and so on. It's going to get worse now, which we can talk about in the subsequent questions. But now to move from that to what you were just talking about, is Turkey's investment in and prioritization of its defense industry, its self-sufficiency capability, the slogan of yerli ve milli, the domestic and national, I guess you can translate it as, is that a tool of domestic policy as well? Is it purely, meant to be? Should we just take it at face value that Turkish policymakers are thinking of this in terms of the country's capabilities, in terms of its foreign policy, what it's able to do worldwide or regionally, and so on? I think, of course, it's a combination of the two. I think it's beyond doubt that this plays very nicely with a voter body that's interested in these things. It's it's not just the whole self-sufficiency argument either. It's also an argument of seeing Turkey in a sort of proud position. It's a matter of pride. Like most nationalisms, it values pride. I mean, perhaps it's not the greatest comparison, but I think it reminds me of what Mussolini was doing with the Italians when he was rising to power. He appealed to the Italians' pride. What was he saying? He was saying, look, Italy has been downtrodden. These other European powers are constantly backstabbing us. They are not respecting us. There is not enough respect, and so on. And that really appealed to a certain demographic, to a certain kind of person who was thinking very much like, yes, we've been the subject of all kinds of conspiracies, that the world is against us, and so on and so forth. So yes, the world should know that we are powerful. So you'll see the traces of this argument in many parts of the Turkish public across the political spectrum.
Do you think that there's a danger with that kind of that kind of nationalism that at some point your bluff gets called. Like, for Mussolini, it's like, well, yeah, of course we can go and invade Ethiopia. This will be no problem at all. And like, with Turkey, it's like, okay, well, sure, you can have limited military operations against the PKK and other Kurdish groups in Iraq, and the SDF and YPG and so on in Syria. Okay, you can sell your drones to Azerbaijan, and they'll work pretty well against an Armenian army, which has not been supplied with particularly modern weapons recently. You can go and do this similar stuff in Libya against Haftar, but I think if they got into like an actually serious war with a country which had serious military hardware, I mean, I think you wonder what would happen if the military falling out with Russia led to actually some serious engagement, for example. I mean, I wonder whether there's just a kind of there's a potential pitfall there that some of the nationalists in the military start believing their own legend about how great their military is, and then they think they can take on somebody that they maybe can't.
I think that's an excellent point. Excellent point. I mean, there's a point where you create a reality, you create a narrative that becomes a reality, and then it starts to feed that narrative. There's a cycle to this, right? And in that cycle, people start believing what used to be just a narrative becomes, something that's very real for them. It's true for Turkish perceptions of history, for example. A lot of people in Turkey, when you talk about history as a professional historian, are shocked to hear what you have to say, because what they think of as history is entirely different. Their reality is different. So in this case, it's a good example of that as well. It is certainly possible that both military and political leadership starts believing in this narrative, and it becomes their reality then. And then they start playing around with that with actual actions. And I've been saying this, for quite a while now, but the Erdogan regime has been dealt an unprecedented hand in history. I mean, the kinds of things that it did in its foreign policy at any other time in history, at any other context in history, would have resulted in far more significant consequences. Few regimes would have survived all the different crises that the Erdogan regime dragged Turkey into. And yet the Erdogan regime somehow always managed to get away with a lot of things that it would not have been able to get away with at any other time. And yes, the examples that you're giving are very apt, I think. When you're looking at the kinds of engagements, military engagements that it got involved in Syria, in Libya, and indirectly in Nagorno-Karabakh, you're looking at environments in which its hardware could be very effective. We'll talk more about that when we talk about drones, I'm sure. And they were limited engagements. It had still a degree of political protection from its allies, even when some of its allies were perhaps working at cross purposes. And even in the case with Russia, there was no direct confrontation with Russia in Syria, for example, even when Turkey was doing things that Russians might not have liked. There was always this back and forth. The Turkish-Russian relations are rather interesting to look at. They're working at cross purposes many times, and yet they're also cooperating on rather interesting aspects. It's a rather unprecedented type of diplomacy for Turkey, to be sure. So yeah, I mean, but what the Turkish public gets out of this, the way that it's presented, is that there's this victorious Erdogan regime going into these different places, into Libya, into Syria, and blah, 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 and helping the friendly Azerbaijani regime and so on. So what they see out of this is that Turkey is victorious, that Turkey is actually succeeding in this sort of policy. But the problem is, when you start this kind of cycle, the chickens come home to roost one day. One day you meet an adversary that is not as comfortable an adversary, or a hamstrung adversary as you have dealt with up to this point. Things could go catastrophically wrong, and things could go out of control in terms of a small conflict escalating into large conflict, escalating into multiple conflicts. We've seen that many times in military history. So you can get drawn into these things.
They have been quite successful at not allowing those small-scale conflicts to escalate. I mean, especially in the relationship with Russia, I think it's very important in that respect. They've managed to compartmentalize the fact that they support completely different sides in a number of proxy areas. But I mean, Turkey has kind of pursued some of these conflicts through proxies, which kind of allows them to to not get directly involved. I mean, I wonder, what happens in Syria once the Assad regime takes back Idlib, for example. What kind of negotiations go on between Turkey and Russia and Syria around what happens to Rojava, for example. But it doesn't strike me that Turkey wants to get involved in a direct conflict with Assad, because that basically is the same as getting involved in the conflict with Russia. But yeah, I mean, maybe we can talk about about drone warfare for a bit, and Baykar Makina, the kind of main new UAV company, although obviously the TAI, Turkish Aerospace Industries, they have also been producing UAVs as well as planes for a while. Baykar is quite interesting because the chief technology officer is one of Erdogan's sons-in-law. So that again gives him this kind of direct link to the kind of prestige that Turkey enjoys from the success of UAVs. I even saw that Baykar Makina is claiming that it's creating an air taxi, which seems like it just seemed like pure propaganda to me. It's like, oh yeah, this company's so amazing, we're going to have people flying through the air in Istanbul in like a few years, and you're like, that's not happening. It's just like some of this stuff you can see, like it's like, yeah, we're going to have a domestic and national car in like 2 years, and you're like 10 years later you're like, so how's that going then?
And even the basis for that car that was originally displayed was not, Turkish design, Turkish engineering, Turkish origins in any sense. Turkish acquired a Saab license, basically.
But that over-promising doesn't really seem to have a negative effect on Turkish public opinion. It's just like, I heard somebody told me every election for the last 10 years, the AKP is like, yeah, we're going to do the domestic and national car now. And then it's like another 4 years later, yeah, we're going to do the domestic and national car now. So that doesn't seem to have any, the fact that they don't actually follow through with those promises, it doesn't really seem to have any negative effects. It's literally just PR that they just roll out.
But there's a dual thing going on there. You see, they don't deliver on a huge number of them, obviously. The car is an excellent example. The same thing with there was supposed to be a national plane that never materialized. That was one of the major promises of one of the elections that you mentioned. But at the same time, when you look at the way that this narrative is sort of used and how the public reacts to this narrative, the public also sees things like, oh, we're building an aircraft carrier. And this is a huge thing for the public. We're now one of the major countries in the world, major powers in the world, that few of them have aircraft carriers, and now we're building our own. And it's true, Turkey is building a certain thing that is convertible to a light aircraft carrier. It's actually an amphibious assault ship. It's a helicopter landing platform more than anything else, but it can house a very small number of fixed-wing aircraft, except of course the aircraft that it was thinking of, the F-35B, is not coming at the moment. So basically it's just a helicopter and UAV platform. It's not a carrier as we understand it. It's not on the same sort of scale of carriers that we think of. And of course the Turkish public also believes that this thing is built with national domestic expertise and means and engineering and so on. And it is being built in Turkey, in Istanbul, to be sure, but multiple systems in it are going to be imported, have to be imported. And the thing itself, the engineering itself, didn't come from Turkey either. I mean, there's actually a sister ship that was built, the Spanish are using it, the Juan Carlos, I believe it's called. So you see this theme in many, many different pieces of hardware where the Turkish public believes that something is being done in Turkey, and it really is being done, except the way that they believe it's being done is not the reality. Same thing with the attack helicopter. There's this sort of very sort of successful design that Turkey is using. It used it successfully in its operations in Syria recently, for example. And that helicopter is being presented as a domestic and national success story. But you look at that helicopter's background, and you don't have to be an expert for this. Anyone with access to Google can do this. You see that it was a design that came out of the late 70s, early 80s. It was operational in Italy. It was designed by Agusta. It was called the Mangusta. And it was produced throughout the 80s and 90s. So we're looking at really a 40-year-old Italian design, a very good design, but not a Turkish domestic and national design. It's built under license. So you can find other examples like that. And that sort of feeds into the public's belief in that some things are being done. Yeah, the card that was promised didn't happen, but that's probably because of foreign intervention. They don't want us to succeed, and yet we're doing this. So there's some of that.
The success of Baikar's drones, particularly as far as I've read, seems to be based on the fact that they're a lot cheaper than a lot of other drones that are made by other big international companies. So it seems like maybe they're not as good as, like, I don't know, a BAE Systems drone, or, like, I don't know, some US drone.
Good
But
is
they're
a
pretty,
relative term. Yeah, we can talk
but they're
about
really cheap to make, so you can have tons of them basically.
Right. And again, everything is relative, right? So the Bayraktar TB2 drone that everyone's talking about costs just a few $1 million per piece. And that's, compared to something like a $20 million drone or a $100 million drone, that's very, very cheap, which means that it's more expendable. It doesn't mean that you can, any country can just, buy hundreds of them and just lose hundreds of them and say, oh, well, that's just it. It's still an investment, but it's a much more acceptable loss in that case, if you look at it that way. But it comes with capabilities. I wouldn't put them on a good versus bad spectrum, but capability spectrum, right? There are different classes of UAVs. Just like there are different classes of land vehicles, different kinds of armored warfare, and so on and so forth. Same for fighter planes, that different kinds of fighter planes doing different things. Drones do different things as well. You look at the U.S. drone industry, and the U.S. is by far, of course, the leader in that technology. U.S. The last time I checked, had 94 different drones in operation or about to be in operation in the coming 2 years. 94. Out of these 94 different platforms, some of them are truly, from the perspective of anyone looking at this stuff without necessarily following them, they look like science fiction stuff. Some of them very high technology items with incredible capabilities, and of course with the cost to accompany that. What Bayraktar is, and many other Turkish drones as well, are relatively simple designs, relatively cheap to build. They're not rocket science to build. Any country with a degree of industry can really build these things. You put a propeller engine on most of them. The propeller engine has been around for a long, long time, more than 100 years. The only things that are significant in those systems are things like optical, things, targeting systems, things like that. And when you look at those systems, targeting, optical things that allow it to do surveillance, that allow it to target, and so on and so forth, as well as the munitions, that's where there's a lot of intake of foreign material. That's where imports are happening. So yes, you're building a relatively simple drone in Turkey for a relatively low price. It is successful in just the right circumstances where your adversary doesn't have air superiority, there's no proper air defense against you, antiquated stuff against you. Of course, it's successful, but there are serious limits to it as well. But that's not how the public sees these things. The public sees these things as being, well, Turkey is producing its own drones. This is a cutting edge technology. It's very impressive. It has been successful. And even some experts start to sort of buy into this a little bit after a while. Turkey, I've just read a couple of op-eds where they were talking about how Turkey is revolutionizing warfare. The warfare paradigm is changing, and so on. And that's an extreme position to take, really. I mean, if anything, the US is doing that, of course. And it hasn't quite arrived. The kinds of things that they are thinking of isn't there yet.
Yeah, I sometimes, like, I was thinking when you were saying how, a lot of people in Turkey are kind of led to believe these are completely domestic products that they're making. It sort of reminded me of a tweet by, like, this British nationalist guy who was, like, responding to the Yorkshire Tea Company, going, "Somebody's told me that your tea's not actually made in Yorkshire; it's made in India. I always thought it was made in Yorkshire." And the tea company's like, "Yeah, no, we don't grow tea in Yorkshire. Actually, we do import it." He's like, "What? You've been lying to me." Anyway, so. Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing is, like, you can see that Turkey's, especially in terms of its drone power and its some of those aspects of its military industrial complex, it has changed and it has progressed a lot, but it's difficult to really kind of say, like, what a game changer that is, because unless you see it, unless you see that stuff really involved in a kind of significant conflict, and all of these conflicts so far have been reasonably limited. I mean, obviously the drones worked really well in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a very kind of mountainous area where Armenia didn't have air superiority in any way.
And the air defense systems were antiquated, really. They were not meant to target drones or anything like that.
But yeah, I guess, is there like would you say that Turkey's kind of like come to a kind of natural, maybe we've seen Turkey come to a kind of a natural stop in terms of what it's able to do militarily within its region, or do you think that there's more that they would like and are able to do? Because obviously, I mean, it doesn't strike me that that there's going to be any serious military conflict within the Eastern Mediterranean, because it would just be too. I mean, you'd have like, probably the French Navy getting involved to support Greece or Cyprus in the case that there was actual military conflict between them and Turkey, which then I think you probably would see some kind of not so great result for certainly for Turkey's navy, which is not. They're obviously not going to take on the navies of multiple NATO members in the Eastern Mediterranean with the navy that they've got. So it doesn't strike me that they're going to push that any further. So looking around the various conflict zones where they are involved, it doesn't really seem to me that they can push anything any further. Like, they've been quite clever in some way in kind of seeing where the boundaries lie and pushing their claims up to the point of where the sanctions are actually starting to bite now. They've kind of tested the limits of their allies' patience in that respect, and it doesn't strike me that it would be wise for them to go any further, which is why this kind of the kind of change in tone towards the West has started since Biden won the election in November. But yeah, I don't know if you think that they are going to push any of these claims any further, or or that it's even possible to do so.
That's a huge subject right there, and I agree with you. I agree with you in that it would be very surprising to see anything beyond heated saber rattling in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Aegean, for all the reasons that you've mentioned, and then some. I don't think Turkey is interested in getting into a conventional war with a neighbor, at least a neighbor that has not been wrecked by civil war, where it can insert itself comfortably. And that's very, very unlikely. I mean, let's never say something is impossible, because we've seen in the history of warfare that things that were thought to be impossible do happen with escalations and so on, but a very unlikely scenario to have anything like that. But they do have the means to push for more instability in the wider region via indirect means. They don't necessarily have to be directly involved militarily to stir up trouble, to get involved in expansionist sort of policy objectives and so on. They have the means such as proxies. They have means such as mercenaries of their own now. The so-called Sadat is an example of that. A mercenary company, essentially, that's what it is. It's called a consultancy, a defense consultancy, and so on, but they all fashion themselves with such terms. So it can use things like that in places where its own direct military involvement would not be possible or would be inadvisable, and still have hard power, let's say, at play, and stir up certain parts of the world. And I can see that most clearly happening in parts of North Africa, in parts of parts of the Middle East as well. It depends on how things sort of play out in the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's, in terms of the what's changing in terms of foreign policy at the moment, you've got this kind of cooling of relations between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which is also leading Turkey to kind of try to normalize its relations with Saudi and the other Gulf states to some extent. Does that hold any particular lessons for what we might see happening in the Middle East? I mean, if Turkey doesn't want to so obviously compete with the Saudis, I mean, does that mean anything for Libya? Does that mean anything for Syria?
It could. I hesitate to speculate, really, because I don't know enough. And it's about the future. Future speculation is a dangerous realm, even though we all participate in it. What I'm thinking of here is what do other regional players, regional actors, think of when they see Turkey and its actions in the last 5 years? What lessons do they draw out of it? And there are different kinds of actors. There are states, of course, and there are different levels of state power, obviously. Jordan and the Saudis are not the same thing, for example. There's that to look at. But also there are non-state actors. They're looking at what Turkey is doing, what it's achieving, how it's achieving those things. If I'm a state actor and I'm looking at what Turkey is achieving, if I'm Egypt, for example, which is in some ways comparable to Turkey, depending on how you frame it. Then I'm getting the idea that, wait, if I'm going to get involved in any kind of hard power conflict in this region, not that it's going to happen, but if it did, it doesn't have to be like it used to be in the mid 20th century, the wars of 1950s and 60s and so on. It can be something of a limited conflict, maybe. Maybe I can get away with a limited conflict. Maybe I can use indirect means. Maybe I can use my own proxies around me. The problem with that kind of lesson, that kind of thinking is if multiple states take that lesson to heart, and Iran has been, of course, doing the whole proxy thing for a while as well, if they start thinking that, okay, why don't we start playing with proxies and limited conflicts here and there, that is a formula for a disaster. It's a formula for never-ending war in an area that those small-scale, what was supposed to be limited-scale confrontations could escalate out of control as well. So that's, I think, something that I would be concerned about, rather than any specific scenario involving, one country's foreign policy versus another country's foreign policy. There are so many players involved there, even without, talking about major world powers and their stake in the region, which adds another layer of complication there. One thing, though, that I would also learn if I was a state actor in the area from Turkey's use of its military industry or its defense industry, and specifically its use of unmanned vehicles. And let's not just think of it in terms of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, but unmanned period, because the land aspect is coming as well. It's not
they have ships as well. I saw that there's a
naval aspect as well. So in our lifetime, we're going to see much more in land and naval warfare that is unmanned elements, that have unmanned elements in it. If I'm thinking of that, there's one thing that we haven't discussed, and the world hasn't really discussed it much either. How are these unmanned systems used on a battlefield, whether that's against a conventional army, whether that's against non-state actors and non-conventional forces and so on and so forth? How are they used? Is there a policy? As far as I'm concerned, the only part of the world where this was a serious matter of debate, a lot of time, energy was spent on it at the policy level, actually, and research, was the US. The US, when you look at the Department of Defense, publicly available sort of documents, you see a huge number of research, debates, as well as policies that clearly indicate how the US is intending to use unmanned systems. When we deal with semi-autonomous or in the future fully autonomous systems, that there will always be a human being in charge, sort of making the final decisions and so on and so forth. These are, well thought documents, the result of years of debates that impose certain restrictions, impose a certain order in something that's very new. Did we see anything like this from Erdogan's Turkey? Have they made a policy about the use of unmanned vehicles, how they're going to be used against adversaries? I haven't seen anything like this. I might have missed it, but I haven't seen anything like that. So we're entering this sort of bonanza in terms of the possibilities, and there is nothing that restricts them in terms of public debate, forming a policy, and so on and so forth. That's very dangerous, especially as semi-autonomous and autonomous systems are on the horizon.
Yeah, it's. Obviously, like when you look back at how Turkey got so involved in Syria and kind of just letting all of these proxy groups go and fight Assad kind of on its behalf, it does strike you that the last 10 years of Turkish foreign policy is kind of just a bit of a like, let's just try a bunch of stuff and see what happens without there being like a particularly solid like end goal in mind to it. And that's kind of how we've got to this point of like, well, you've gone as far as you can in a bunch of different directions in trying to kind of remake Turkey as a kind of almost semi-independent regional power that is, and I think also you can relate that to the kind of withdrawal of US interest to some extent from being the kind of traditional hegemon of the Middle East. But I guess that's one of the questions that's interesting now with the new Biden administration coming in. Where does the United States also see its role in that area? And I think that's perhaps why you see Turkey being a bit more cautious now, because they're waiting for some kind of cue from the Americans in terms of to what extent the United States sees itself carrying on being involved in the Middle East.
Certainly. And what the Biden administration does in terms of its policy in the Middle East, where Turkey, of course, is very active, will determine a lot of the course of a lot of actors, including Turkey. But if the Biden administration does not have a very clear approach to Turkey, in that it does not make its priorities crystal clear. It does not draw a line in the sand here and there and say, look, you can do this, you cannot do that, we don't want you to do this, blah, 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 in very clear terms, and leaves things a little bit on a case-by-case basis. Then that leaves room for the Erdogan regime to fill in the sort of spaces in those case-by-case situations, to sort of still test the limits, what it can get away with, and so on. And it has the tools now. The tools mean that they don't lose soldiers, and they don't have to talk to their domestic audience saying that, oh, we've lost this many soldiers. It's just a bunch of drones that have been, involved. If they fall, not a big deal. So it makes it more likely. Having these tools makes you more likely to be involved in aggressive or expansionist policies.
Apparently, Biden's not been returning the calls from Ibrahim Kalin or whoever was making the calls. They were asked if they had talked to the incoming Biden administration the other day, and they said we've called, but we haven't had a call back yet.
We didn't have a response. And
so I don't know whether that suggests that the Biden administration hasn't formulated a coherent policy towards Turkey or towards the region yet.
Right. It doesn't necessarily mean anything, I think.
I do wonder whether, given the amount of domestic fixing that the Democrats might want to do, how much appetite or energy they'll have left for a reinvigorated Middle Eastern policy. And I mean that maybe that's the potential weakness, or something that we might see become a problem for the United States in the next 4 years, is if they don't have a particularly good idea of what they want to see happen, especially in a place like Syria. Being a kind of apparently a reasonably long-term supporter of Kurdish rights. Biden said, I think he told the KRG Parliament in 2003 or 2004 at one point, the mountains aren't your only friends. So whether that actually means anything in practice we'll have to see, because I don't know how much appetite there'll be domestically in the United States for wanting to get more involved in Syria again. Yeah,
and again, we're getting into speculation here, but I agree with everything that you've said, in that there is a huge domestic agenda to deal with here. It's not clear how that will play into the foreign policy as far as the Middle East is concerned, and so on. But in the background of our thoughts here, with this very sort of current agenda that we're sort of processing, in the background of our thoughts, I always have the idea that the concept that we mentioned before, the military-industrial complex, should sort of hover there in our minds. It is not gone. It's by any means. It is a very powerful combination of things. It's not just military and industry. It's also involving many other elements from the media, from think tanks, a whole bunch of other components to it. And it's not just a U.S. institution anymore. At the beginning, we talked about that a little bit. It used to be a U.S. institution. That's where the concept came out, with Eisenhower first mentioning it back in '59. But now it's a global enterprise, both in a purely business sense and in terms of its reach. You look at military contracts and so on, and who gets them. U.S. companies compete everywhere around the world. British companies, French companies, Italian companies, German companies compete everywhere around the world, including in the U.S. So now it's a worldwide military-industrial complex with all the add-ons. When you have something that is this powerful, this with such a extensive reach, it's impossible that it will not have any impact on foreign policy. I'm not saying that, we should be constantly thinking like conspiracy theories. Oh, the military-industrial complex is hovering and is pushing buttons so that new wars will be started because of that. Whether that happens or not, or that happened or not, is an entirely different field. But when you have such influence and such power, structural power, you also cannot say that categorically foreign policy of the US or any other country is independent of it. You can't say that either, I think. And that's true for Turkey as well.
So maybe we can just wrap it up here, because I don't know how much appetite everybody's got at the start of the year for listening to us talk about weapons. But I think and I think also at some point we get into speculation where we don't know what's going to happen this year. I mean it's going to be interesting to see. I think when you look at something like the crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean, I think that when I've looked at what are the choke points of trying to do something about the competing maritime claims, it does seem to me like there is a diplomatic solution possible there. Turkey could join the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and then be subject to the kind of legal jurisdiction of the court of that treaty. I think. I mean, that seems to be one of the problems at the moment, is that there's no legal mechanism for deciding whose claim is right in that context. So,
well, that's why Turkey didn't become part of it, because if they become part of it, then they are going to be subject to its rules. And the Turkish idea of the Mavi Vatan, the blue homeland, is not really in accordance with anything that they would have to abide by if they become part of that agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like sometimes if you've got a crisis like this and you've got a bunch of options to solve it, you've got you can keep on hitting the diplomacy button. If you've got diplomacy and war, you can keep on hitting the diplomacy button for a really long time without getting anywhere. And to some extent, I want to be kind of sympathetic. I try and be to some extent sympathetic with the Turkish government's agenda, writing about Turkey. I feel like I owe it to them to try and understand what their position is anyway, they've decided to go with the rather than the diplomacy button, which is not working. They've decided in a bunch of cases to go okay, well, let's see how far we can get through hard power rather than this other thing that's not working for us. But I certainly hope anyway that they'll go back to pressing the diplomacy button in terms of at least the Eastern Mediterranean, because I think that would be a real possibility for insecurity if Turkey did get into an open conflict with other NATO powers, and theoretically you could even see Turkey leaving NATO.
If it
went. Let me ask you a question. Yeah, let me ask you a question, actually. You've been asking all the questions, right? Yeah. So what do you think would happen if Turkey found a diplomatic solution to what's going on in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean regarding the blue homeland that did not go in accordance with everything that Turkey has been selling to its home public regarding, how they're going to defend the blue homeland at all costs and blah, blah, blah. How do they sell what the home public might consider a defeat? Concession of the blue homeland or something like that? Would they be willing to do that?
I think so. I think that the Turkish government has a pliant enough media that it can pretty much sell whatever message it wants to its supporters, and they'll probably happily lap it up. I mean, I think it depends what level of compromise it was, right? I think if they went to some kind of international court or sought legal jurisdiction over their competing claims in the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey's claim is not actually that bad. The thing is, Castellarizo, as the most easterly Greek island, theoretically creates this maritime zone to the south of it, and I think to be reasonably generous to the Turkish government, they have a point that a very, very small island shouldn't necessarily create a huge maritime economic zone. So I think that if they did go to a court, they'd probably get something out of it, a reasonably good compromise. And I think that they would be able to sell that to their domestic public, because they would say, well, before Greece said all of that was theirs, and now actually, now we've got all of this stuff. So But yeah, I think you know, like especially if Turkey's going to have a snap election in the next year or two. Well, I mean, if it's a snap election, it'll have to be in the next year or two before the scheduled election 2023. But you know, I think a lot of this stuff has definitely been you know, like the AKP government's attempt to do kind of PR opinion forming in the run up to the 100th anniversary of the Turkish Republic in 2023. They want to get to that point and say, look at how far we've come in the last 20 years, and you know, given that they've got a very favourable playing field to play on, which is their pliant Turkish media, you know, I think that they will be able to get to 2023 and say, well, look at all of the stuff that we've done, and it will be difficult for their opponents to say, well, yes, but you know, you've also done all these other things that are really problematic. But yeah, I think it's an open question of how much further they want to push their headline achievements before they get to 2023, and how much that's really possible.
In terms of wrapping up, since that's what
Yes.
I just talked about, since we started out talking about the Turkish defense industry, I think a thought that should sort of stay with us is there are two dangers in regarding the Turkish defense industry's position in the world. One of them is dismissing it out of hand, saying that, oh, this is nothing significant. Most of the significant parts are coming from abroad. They are only successful in limited sort of markets and so on and so forth. That they are not something to be taken seriously. They are something to be taken seriously. They are a significant part of the worldwide sector. The other problem, though, is overestimating what it is. And that's, I think, I see far more of overestimating than underestimating it. And I mean, it is the 14th largest exporter in the world. It's not, and when you look at the numbers, that's like less than 1% of the world's exports, arms exports, or just about 1% of the world's arms exports. It still imports a huge quantity of stuff compared to its exports. And overestimating it also serves various kinds of political agendas, unlike underestimating, which is also wrong, but I don't see a lot of dangerous agendas coming out of that. Overestimating it serves these political agendas. So I think that anything that goes forward in terms of analyzing the Turkish defense industry should try to sort of get a balance there instead of overestimating or underestimating it. Let's look at it as it is, in the comparative picture. Where does it stand in the world? It is a minor player in the world, and it's not a major player in the world. When you compare it to the top 5 or 6, defense industries in the world, countries with the defense industries, it's not there. And even though it had stated that it aimed to be there, it aimed to be number 8 or number 7, I think, by 2023. That was one of the aims I read somewhere. That's not likely to happen given its current shape of the economy, given a whole bunch of geopolitical events and world events. It's not likely to happen, if it ever was likely to happen. These things don't just happen very quickly. I mean, that huge escalation, that huge sort of increase in volume of the Turkish defense industry was in a unique set of circumstances. Nothing is sustainable at that same rate of acceleration in an industry like this. So that's what I would sort of use as a sort of way of wrapping up our thoughts on this as well.
But maybe, Axel, to empathize with Turkish nationalists for a second, maybe you're just saying that because you're jealous of the local and domestic helicopter and the airport and the bridge.
Yes, indeed.
It's a big airport. It's very. I was impressed when I went there. I've got no problem as a British person saying that Turkey's new airport's good. It's just very empty because there's not a lot of people there.
Exactly. Does it make a lot of economic sense? I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, at least the Turkish defense industry does make some economic sense because they can sell all those drones. I mean, they're making some money out of it. So.
And drones are in fact a small part of the overall thing. They're selling much more in the way of armored cars and personnel carriers and stuff like that actually make more money.
Right. Well, thank you very much for coming on my podcast. And I hope that we've said some things that are of interest to people. All of those people out there who are, hugely interested in the Turkish drone industry, which hopefully is not just the Turkish drone industry. Hopefully there's a whole bunch of drone fans out there who are really interested and will come and watch my podcast. So thank you very much, Axel, for talking to me and sharing your knowledge on this subject. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and thanks also to all of the listeners. And I hope you are having a lovely weekend too. Although this is probably not going to be published on a weekend, so whatever day it is, I hope you're having a great day. Thank you very much, Axel, and I'll speak to you later.